They came to us wearing silk and smug smiles, the Council of Nine towering, serpentine and ancient, they called themselves the Zarenth Dominion, a species so old they claimed to have watched stars die and be reborn. They stood before the unified human assembly and offered terms, not peace, no compliance. They cloaked it in diplomacy, in ritual, in flowery words carved over centuries of arrogance. But the truth was simple: submit or vanish. Admiral Thorne stood at the edge of the assembly chamber, arms crossed. Unreadable as always, his uniform was stark black, worn with pride and silence. He hadn't spoken a word during the entire 2-hour session. He didn't need to. The Council's offer had made one thing painfully clear. They thought humans were weak negotiators, beggars in iron suits. But Earth never forgot history, not the kind carved into marble or broadcast in parades, the kind buried in graves, soaked in dirt and etched into bone. When the Zarenth slaughtered the mining outposts in the Ares Belt, not with armies but with precision strikes on civilian habitats, the message was clear: they weren't trying to conquer us, they wanted to remind us where we stood in their cosmic hierarchy beneath them. President Haver gave them a polite nod, thanked them for the offer, and gave the usual diplomatic response. Something about taking it back to the Earth Senate, something about discussion, consensus, blah blah blah. The moment the 9 ambassadors slithered out of the hall, Thorne turned and muttered 2 words: Fleet Command. And that was that. No press release, no grand speech, no rallies in the streets or banners waving in the sky, just silence. And then ships, they left from Titan, Mars, and Earth orbit, one after another, sleek, dark, angular, born ice, fire, and pressure, not made for parades, made for punishment. The ISS Retribution led the charge, the crown jewel of the Black Armada, 5 km long, plated in obsidian steel, armed with enough plasma to boil oceans, and at its helm Thorne himself. No negotiations, no warning. When they exited slip space above the Zarenth's outer rim station, Zelthar Prime, the Dominion didn't even raise their shields. They were still waiting for an envoy. They got nukes. Instead, it wasn't just about the war. It was about the message: you take one of ours, we take everything from you. You offer us chains with a diplomatic smile, we send back your ashes with a name etched into them. And so the finest battle fleet in human history carved its name across the stars, not in pride, not for conquest, but because they had learned the hard way. Sometimes peace is only possible when one side stops breathing. Thorne sat in the command chair, watching the flames bloom across Zelthar's sky. He didn't flinch, he didn't smile. He just whispered to himself, negotiate. The fires on Zelthar Prime hadn't even died out when the first retaliation message came, a garbled signal shot through with static and laced with venom. The voice that came through the comms was high-pitched, arrogant, like it had never been told no. This act of war will not be tolerated. Earth's aggression will be answered with full military action. The Zarenth Dominion does not bow. Thorne stared at the hollow screen without blinking. He didn't respond. He turned to his exo Commander Durich, a lean, quiet man who'd served with Thorne for 15 years. Durich didn't need orders. He simply nodded and gave the signal, fleet-wide. He said, engage blackout protocol. The fleet vanished from scans like ghosts pulled back into the dark. 2 Weeks passed, no interviews, no statements, not even a whisper of where the human fleet had gone. The media on Earth screamed for answers. The Galactic Accord condemned the unprovoked violence. The Senate fumbled with statements, trying to downplay what everyone already knew. The Zarenth had made a mistake. Fatal one. They thought they were facing politicians. What they got was Admiral Thorn. The man wasn't born in a palace or a military academy. He'd grown up in the mining colonies of the Martian belt. His father died in a pressure breach. His mother in a riot when oxygen rations failed. Thorn had survived on instinct, grit, and a cold, bitter understanding of the universe. Nobody gives you peace. You take it or you bury those who would steal it. His first command was a freighter-turned-gunship during the War of the 7 colonies. He earned his stars the hard way, ship by ship, scar by scar, and the men who followed him, they weren't diplomats, they were soldiers of circumstance, born in broken worlds, raised with one truth: Earth doesn't kneel. The fleet wasn't idle. It had split 10 task forces, each with a specific target: strategic strikes, not annihilation. They wanted the Dominion crippled, not wiped out. They wanted them to remember why humans should never be underestimated again. Task Force Aegis hit a supply route near the Velari Gate. They didn't just destroy cargo ships, they seized them, turned Dominion tech into scrap, and used it to upgrade their own fighters. Left the wreckage drifting near civilian sectors. Message to any allies the Zarenth might have had: Task Force Sabre took out a weapons depot on IOS 9. Surgical strike. No civilian casualties. The orbital cannon platform that once defended an entire quadrant gone in less than 3 minutes. But it was Task Force Revenant under Thorn that made the real impact. They went for Zarenth's history. Beneath the cloud rings of Valen spine, one of the oldest Dominion relics, stood the Temple of the First Stars, a planet-sized station made entirely of crystalline metal, older than most civilizations. Sacred, untouchable. Humans didn't touch it, they leveled it. Thorn watched as the beam from the Retribution's primary cannon tore through the station's core. The explosion lit up half the sector, fragments raining into the gravity well, like glittering bones of a fallen god. Commander Durich didn't say a word, but his hands trembled at the console. "Sir," he finally said, voice low, "that was a cultural site." Thorn didn't turn, so was New Damascus before they wiped it off the map. Dirk didn't argue. He knew what this was: not war, not diplomacy, a reckoning. In the weeks that followed, Dominion morale plummeted, outposts went silent, communications jammed, whole sectors went dark. Refugees from fringe colonies began to speak of shadows, human ships appearing without warning, vanishing just as quickly, not conquering, not occupying, just breaking things, and always leaving one thing behind: the same message sprinted in crude Terran script on wreckage walls and screens: "We do not negotiate with murderers." The Dominion tried to retaliate. They sent 5 war fleets, each larger than the human contingents they were chasing. But Thorn didn't fight them head-on. He made them chase ghosts. Every time they arrived, they found burned stations, emptied hangars, or traps that left them bleeding. Fleets fractured. Admirals blamed one another. Their unity shattered faster than their armor. But for all the strikes, all the fury, Thorn hadn't forgotten what started it. New Damascus, a mining colony with 10,000 civilians. No weapons, no shields, just drills and cargo. The Zarenth hit it with kinetic rods from orbit. No warning, no demands, just a test to see if humans would take it. They didn't. They buried the dead silence and whispered a promise into the soil. We'll make them remember. One night, if you could call it that, in deep space, Thorn sat alone in his quarters, lights dimmed, a single photo. In front of him, a girl no older than 12, laughing with her face covered in dirt and grease, sitting beside a collapsed drill unit. His daughter, he hadn't seen her since the war started. She'd been on New Damascus. Durich once asked him gently why he never talked about it. Thorn only said, talking doesn't change what they did. And so he led the fleet, not as a hero, not as a patriot, but as a father, without a grave to visit. As the campaign dragged into its third month, cracks formed in the Dominion. Lesser houses began to rebel. Old debts called in. Planets that had feared Zarenth rule for centuries suddenly stopped paying tribute. The smell of blood drew enemies, and Earth just watched. The Senate had officially condemned unauthorized military actions. Unofficially, they let Thorn run wild, because even the most cowardly politician understood one truth: humanity had been humiliated, and silence was no longer an option. Then came the day they didn't expect. A signal from the Dominion high seat. Direct, unencrypted. The message was simple: we request terms. Commander Durich looked at Thorn, breath caught. They're surrendering. Thorn didn't respond right away. He stared at the message, the words that once would have felt like victory, but there was no pride in his eyes, no joy. Only that quiet, familiar anger, the kind that doesn't burn but freezes. No, he said, they're stalling, buying time, waiting for their reinforcements. From the Obsidian Reach, Dirk blinked. We don't have proof of that, that's just I know them, Thorn cut in. They've done this before to others. Offer peace, delay, then strike with overwhelming force. So what do? Thorn stood, walked to the main viewport. Stars stretched out in endless silence. He clenched his jaw. We remind them that when humans say never again, we mean it. The final push began, this time no subtlety. The retribution jumped directly into the Zarenth core system, the heart of the Dominion. Dozens of enemy ships scrambled to intercept. Orbital stations powered up, planetary shields ignited. And Thorn gave the order: engage. Everything. The battle was chaos. Missiles screamed across the void, carving trails of fire. Plasma bolts punched through shielding. Like paper, drones swarmed. Fighters spun in the debris of shattered hulls. Massive ships collided, tearing chunks out of one another. Explosions rolled like thunder in the black, and in the center of it all, the retribution carved a straight path through the heart of the Dominion. A suicidal run unless you were Thorn. He didn't care if he came back. He only cared that they remembered that Earth remembers. 3 hours in, the Dominion flagship, the Ark-Zelen, fell. Its remains broke apart like dying embers on the bridge of the Retribution. Smoke and fire danced in the air, systems failing, power flickering. Thorn stood amid the chaos, blood running down his temple, and spoke calmly into the fleet-wide comm. Target the Citadel. Durich grabbed his arm. That's a civilian city. Thorn didn't blink. They called it a military hub when they leveled New Damascus. I'm just returning the favor. The Citadel burned. The ashes of the Citadel drifted through Space like gray snow, billions had lived. There, billions. Not all were soldiers, not all were guilty. But that didn't matter anymore. Thorn hadn't come to make clean kills or strategic statements. He came to end the debate. He came to make the Zarenth stop breathing for 3 full days. After the final strike, the Retribution floated above the wreckage, damaged, scarred, alive. The enemy wasn't inside the ship. The silence was unbearable. The kind of quiet that weighed on your skin, not relief, not victory, just silence. Commander Durich walked through the ship's dimmed corridors like a man trying to make sense of what he'd just witnessed. He wasn't afraid of Thorn. No one was, not because Thorn was soft, but because fear had no place in a man who already knew what had to be done. But now, even Dirk felt something shifting. When he entered the war room, he found Thorn standing over a series of broken Dominion flight logs, hands behind his back, eyes bloodshot but still burning. I counted the escape pods, Dirk said. Quietly, Thorn didn't turn, and there weren't enough. Still, Thorn said. Nothing. Durich stepped closer. There were children, Admiral, and so were they. Ones on New Damascus. You're starting to sound like them. Now Thorn turned. His eyes were tired, jaw set like steel. But his voice didn't rise. He didn't shout. You ever hold someone in your arms while they suffocated because the air scrubbers gave out? Thorn asked. You ever look a mother in the eyes while she's trying to decide which child to give the last oxygen mask to? You ever dig through rubble with your bare hands because you could still hear crying underneath, even though you knew damn well nobody survives an orbital rod? Dirk didn't speak. Don't preach to me, Thorn said coldly. Not until you've buried your own blood. Durich lowered his head. Thorn wasn't proud of what he'd done. He wasn't trying to justify it. This wasn't about pride or legacy. This was about making sure no one else ever thought humanity could be pushed again. Back on Earth, the political nightmare was peaking. Every broadcast screamed the same headlines. Admiral Thorn goes rogue, genocide or justice, galactic accord demands answers, Citadel massacre, has Earth crossed the line? Senators scrambled, leaders ducked behind bureaucratic shields. Even President Haver, who'd quietly supported the campaign from the start, now publicly distanced herself from the fleet's actions. But none of that mattered, not to the people on the streets of New Berlin, on the colony domes of Titan, in the domed cities of Europa. They painted Thorn's name on walls. They lit candles beneath murals of Retribution's silhouette. They held vigils not for the fallen Dominion, but for the ones no one had ever answered for. The masses weren't ashamed of Thor. They were grateful, but there were those who weren't. From the edge of Dominion space came whispers. The Aurelian Pact, an alliance of species who had once feared the Dominion's expansion, now saw Earth as the bigger threat. They're unhinged. One Aurelian broadcast said savage they claim to protect their own, but what will stop them when someone disagrees with them next? And from deep within the Obsidian Reach, a region so remote even the Dominion had avoided it, something ancient stirred. Fleet, not Zarenth, worse, the Drakish conquered a species Earth had only heard about in myths. Even the Dominion had feared them once. Now, with the balance of power shattered, they moved again. Inside the Retribution, Thorn received a transmission encrypted direct from Earth, the President herself, her voice was cold, formal. Admiral Thorne, you are ordered to return to Sol System for immediate debriefing. Stand down, cease all operations. You are hereby relieved of command. The silence after her words was deafening. Thorne didn't answer right away. Durich watched him carefully. The crew in the command center waited, breath caught in their chests. Thorne finally walked to the console, pressed a button. No, the line went dead. Durich blinked. Sir, I'm not done. Thorne said, sir, refusing a direct order from the President is she's not out here, we are. Dirk tried again, softer this time. Then what's the plan? Keep fighting. The Dominion is broken, their capitals gone, the high seat surrendered. What else is there? Thorne looked at the star map, slowly zoomed in on the Obsidian Reach. There's something coming. Durich frowned. From where? I don't know, but I've seen the signs. Ghost reading, strange transmissions. Ships going dark in the edge systems. He tapped a series of logs, static heavy. Recording screams, symbols no one recognized, ships torn open like paper. I don't think we were the only ones watching the Dominion fall. 3 days later, confirmation came. The outer colonies stopped transmitting. No warning, no debris, just silence. Ships sent to investigate vanished, too. Not destroyed, gone. Retributions. Intelligence Corps began picking up gravitational distortions near the edge of charted space, massive ones moving fast like a wave, and then a fragment came through, one of Earth's long-range recon vessels. The ESV Kestrel managed to broadcast an emergency signal before it disappeared. Only one word made it through. Drakish. Dirk stared at the screen. They're real. Thorne nodded once, and they're coming. There was no time to explain it to Earth, no time to beg for reinforcements. The human fleet was scattered, repairing, recovering. The Senate was still busy arguing about war crimes, so Thorne made a decision. He rerouted the entire Black Armada, what was left of it, toward the Reach. They would intercept the wave before it reached Earth inner systems. Durich stood with him in the command center. This is suicide, he said. Thorne nodded. Probably. There's less than 200 ships left in fighting condition, then we'll make them count. Durich hesitated. Why not run? Thorne finally looked at him, not with anger, not with coldness, but with something Durich hadn't seen in a long time. Conviction. If we die out here, maybe Earth will wake up. Maybe they'll stop treating peace like a guarantee and remember it's something that's bought with blood. The fleet arrived at the edge of the Reach. The sky was wrong there. The stars flickered like they were afraid to shine. Space itself seemed thicker, heavier, like it had been broken and stitched back together wrong. And then the Drakish arrived. No warning, no formation. They didn't even look like ships, more like massive living monoliths, black and red, shifting like muscle and bone, pulsing with something organic alive. And then they opened fire. The first volley ripped through 3 human cruisers like butter. One ship spun into a gravity rift and simply folded in on itself. Another was engulfed in what looked like liquid fire. No escape pods, no survivors. Durich screamed orders. Men and women ran to their stations. Retribution's hull trembled under the pressure, but Thorne didn't retreat. He gave the one order everyone had been waiting for: full barrage, no mercy. And the Black Armada roared back, rail guns lit the void, plasma beams carved into the darkness, missile storms filled the gaps, every ship, every cannon, every fighter moved like one body, not for glory, not for survival, for Earth, for New Damascus, for the ones already lost. Hours passed like seconds, space burned. The Drakish lost ships, not many but enough. For the first time in thousands of years they met something that fought back, and then the signal came from deep within the Drakish line, a voice low, inhuman, echoing through every comms channel. You should have stayed in your place. Thorn answered with one final command. All ships break formation, hit them from all sides, burn them down. The battle wasn't over, but the message was clear. Humans weren't diplomats anymore. They were fire, they were vengeance, they were the storm the galaxy thought would never come. The bridge of the retribution was chaos. Wrapped in steel, red lights pulsed from every wall. The klaxon wailed in a steady rhythm, not panicked, not frantic, just cold and repetitive, like a heartbeat warning of death. Crew shouted, systems flickered, fires burst from busted conduits and were sealed with brutal efficiency. Outside in the endless black, the Drakish pushed harder. Their ships didn't move like machines. They flowed, bending in impossible ways, their shapes changing mid-flight. Every time a human cruiser scored a hit, it looked like the enemy ship just bled, then healed, then kept coming. Durich wiped a streak of blood off his brow and leaned over the console. 4 more down, 7 crippled, no word from Task Group Theta. I think they're gone. Thorn didn't flinch. His voice was low, quiet. What's left? 87 ships still fighting, 32 at half power. That's less than half the fleet. Sir, Thorn looked out at the battle through the viewport. Not fear, not hesitation, just calculation. We hold. Durich clenched his jaw. You keep saying that. For how long? As long as it takes. The Drakish mother ship, if you could call it that, had appeared in the center of their lines 3 hours earlier. A million creature of writhing metal and living tendrils, its core pulsing like a heartbeat. Whenever it surged, another wave of distortion would erupt across human systems. Thorn had seen a lot in his career: orbital bombardments, mutiny, collapse. But this was different. The Dominion was arrogant, yes, cruel, definitely, but they were still bound by logic, strategy, politics. The Dikesh didn't care about strategy. They came to devour. Inside the medbay, bodies were piling up. Not all dead, not yet, but close. Engineers with burns across half their bodies, Marines coughing up black fluid from biological attacks, pilots whose minds were shaken loose from something they saw in the reach, something they couldn't explain. One of them, a kid barely out of training named Webb, had to be restrained. He kept repeating the same phrase over and over. It's inside the light. It's inside the light. Thorn passed him on his way through the lower deck. He paused just for a second, looking at the trembling boy strapped to the bed. He saw it. One of the medics whispered. He flew too close to one of the organic pods. They do something to your mind. Thorn nodded once, noted it, and moved on. He couldn't afford to break now. On the outer edge of the battle, a small detachment of stealth corvettes, remnants of Task Group Wraith, managed to slip past the Drakish flank. Captain Arlen, one of Thorn's few remaining original officers, opened a direct channel. We've got a read on their central ship. Sir, there's something glowing inside. Like a power source, something ancient. Thorn stepped toward the comms. Can you hit it? We can try, but we'll only get one shot. After that, we're exposed. There was a long silence. Thorn finally answered, voice flat. Take the shot. Arlen didn't argue. Didn't plead for reinforcements. He just said for New Damascus. Then the line went silent. 30 minutes later, the shot hit. A concentrated torpedo burst, plasma. Encased radiation tipped a weapon Thorn had personally pushed to have. Built years ago when no one thought it was needed, it struck the glowing core. In the Drakish mothership's center. Mass, and for the first time the enemy screamed. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't a comm signal. It was raw sound, vibrating through the vacuum in ways that broke the laws of physics. The scream shattered half the retribution. Sensors, 3 crewmen collapsed, bleeding from the ears, but the ship reeled. It didn't die, but it staggered. On the bridge, Dirk stared at the data. We heard it. Thorn leaned over the console. It's bleeding energy. That scream, it must be part of how they communicate. Maybe even how they coordinate. They're linked, so what now? Thorn didn't blink. We cut deeper. He opened the fleet-wide channel, his voice calm, quiet, not inspiring, not theatrical, just final. We've drawn blood. You don't stop when your enemy bleeds. You finish the job. We'll never get another shot like this. So either we die out here or they do. The fleet answered. The battered remnants of the Black Armada surged forward, not in tight formation, not in clean waves, but like wolves, each ship hunting for a soft spot in the chaos. Frigates rammed larger Drakish creatures. Destroyers dumped their final fuel cells into the engines for one last charge. Fighters flew in suicide runs just to buy seconds. Every second bought meant another salvo. From the Retribution, another rail gun. Round through alien bone, another missile detonated inside living flesh. And still the Drakish fought back, even wounded. They were stronger, older, faster, but they'd never fought like this before. They'd never fought humans. With nothing left to lose, inside the command center, alarms blared. Starboard. Wings gone, someone shouted. Hull breach. On decks 9 through 12, the Retribution groaned. Thorn gripped the rail seal. The decks, purge if necessary. Durich turned. There are still men down there. We don't hold this line. It doesn't matter. Seal it. Durich hesitated, then nodded. The decks were purged. 100 more dead, but the ship kept moving. Then came the critical moment. The mothership's core began to pulse erratically, like it was panicking, trying to stabilize. Thorn saw it, knew the pattern. It was preparing to jump. They're going to retreat, he muttered. Durich looked at him. Isn't that a good thing? No, Thorn said. They'll come back with more, with worse. We don't get second chances with things like this. He looked around the bridge, took a deep breath. Prepare for forward ram. The room went dead silent. Durich stepped forward, face pale. Sir, that's suicide. I know your orders. I didn't come this far to let this thing crawl back into the dark. He looked around at his crew. You don't have to stay. Anyone who wants to jump ship, now's the time. Get to the escape pods. That's an order. Not one man moved. The Retribution turned. Its engines flared red. Its nose aimed straight at the Drakish mothership's exposed heart. Everything else fell away. The screams, the alarms, the blood. Thorn stood straight, hands behind his back, eyes forward, and whispered one last time for New Damascus. The collision wasn't clean, it wasn't cinematic, it was brutal. The retribution tore through the Drakish mother ship like a bullet through wet bone. Explosions rippled across both hulls, organic matter and human steel tore into one another, fire bloomed in the void, then the core ruptured. Blast of light, black, red, and violet, expanded outward like a dying star. And then, silence. Hours passed, the battlefield was still. Wreckage drifted, no sign of the mother ship, no trace of the retribution. But the rest of the Drakish, they were gone, vanished, retreated, dead. No one could say for sure, but they were no longer devouring colonies, no longer jamming signals, no longer ripping ships apart in silence, and the human fleet, broken, bleeding, but alive. Back on Earth, the headlines changed. Thorn missing, presumed dead. Battlefleet retribution sacrificed to stop alien menace, from war criminal to savior, the admiral who held the line. Monuments were raised, statues built. School children recited his name, but there were no medals for Thorn, no parades. He never came home, just a black box recovered weeks later, floating among the wreckage. Inside it, a single message, 5 words. Don't let them come back. The universe doesn't pause for dead men, not even men like Admiral Thorn. 3 months after the retribution tore through the heart of the Drakish mother ship and vanished into radioactive silence, the galaxy resumed its slow spin. Trade routes reopened, refugee colonies returned to flickering life. New leaders stepped forward, most wearing medals they didn't earn, giving speeches they didn't believe. The Galactic Accord called it a miracle, a triumph of unity against a common threat, but Earth knew the truth. It wasn't unity that had saved them, it was vengeance, pure, unfiltered, unapologetic vengeance. In the polished halls of the Earth Senate, the story changed faster than the blood dried. At first, Thorn was a rogue, a butcher, a man who cost Earth its diplomatic standing, but once the Drakish pulled back, once the remains of the Black Armada returned with evidence of victory, the narrative flipped. Now, Thorn was a hero, a necessary evil, the man who held the line. Senator Wexon, one of Thorn's loudest critics during the early campaigns, stood at a podium in front of a crowd of 10,000 and spoke with polished sincerity. Let history remember Admiral Thorn as the sword that defended our people. Brutal, yes, but sometimes the galaxy demands brutality to ensure peace. Durich watched from the edge of the crowd, arms folded. He was clean-shaven now, uniform pressed, wearing a medal that weighed like guilt on his chest. He hadn't taken the promotion they offered him. Fleet Admiral, he refused. He didn't want Thorn's chair, he wanted answers back. On the frigate Remembrance, one of the surviving ships from the final battle, Dirk spent his days combing through wreckage logs. Whatever the retribution hadn't taken with it into the fire, he cataloged whole fragments, personal logs, data drives. That's when he found it, a signal, weak, distorted, embedded in the black box Thorn left behind. 5 words had been decrypted immediately: don't let them come back. But there was more. Durich took it to his private quarters, ran the signal through 5 layers of decryptions, then enhanced the waveform by passing it through the ship's old Dominion-hacked AI core, a trick Thorn would have shut down on the spot. But Thorn wasn't here anymore. The voice that came through the final file was Unmistakable. Thorn, but he sounded off slower. Weary, as if he was speaking from far. Away, not just in distance, but in time. If this message reaches Earth, I'm likely dead. That was always the plan. But if you're hearing this, then I failed. I didn't stop them. Not really. The Drakish aren't just a species. They're a system, a weapon, something older than any of us can understand. I've seen the inside of their command core. It wasn't just biological, it was familiar. A pause, a deep breath. They were using Terran code, Earth. Encryption patterns from 30 years ago. Durich sat straight, heart pounding. Someone somewhere has been feeding them. Helping them grow. Maybe it was the Dominion, maybe not, but someone wanted this war. The recording fizzled, the last sentence barely audible through static. Watch the Senate, watch the reach, then silence. Durich didn't sleep that night. He sat in his chair, boots planted, the recording playing over and over. Terran code and the Drakish systems. It didn't make sense. The reach was deep space. Hell barely charted, full of anomalies. Black holes and ancient wrecks. The Dominion had ignored it for centuries. And now it was central to everything. Durich didn't believe in ghosts. But he believed in war, in the ugly side of war, the backroom deals, the weapons, contracts, the clean suits who never bled but always profited. And Thorn had always warned him, there's no such thing as a clean war, Durich. There's just cleaner lies. A week later, the Senate held a closed door session, only high clearance military personnel were invited. Durich was one of them. The room was carved from lunar stone, soundproof, encrypted. No broadcasting equipment, just old-fashioned chairs, files, and people who played with the fates of worlds. President Haver was there, so was Wexon, and a man Durich didn't recognize. Tall, expressionless, suit tailored with impossible precision. The president stood first. We now know the Drakish threat is neutralized. Our forces under Admiral Thorn bought us that peace, but we must discuss what comes next. Durich raised a hand. What about the signal? They looked at him. Haver frowned. What signal? Dirk didn't flinch. The one Thorn left, the one that said someone was feeding them our code. Wexon chuckled, cold and short. There's no evidence of that. Durich slid a data chip across the table. There is. Now, they didn't even touch it. The suit in the corner finally spoke. Voice smooth, polished, like he'd rehearsed every syllable 100 times. You were a good officer, Commander. Brave, loyal. Let's not ruin that with conspiracy theories. Dirk narrowed his eyes. Who are you? The man smiled thinly. A servant of peace. Durich stood. You fed them, didn't you? You fed the Drakish, let them grow. Gave them Dominion data, Earth data, all of it just to trigger the war. No one denied it, not directly. Haver only sighed. Earth needed unity. The Dominion had divided us for too long. A common enemy was necessary. Durich laughed, once bitter. So we lit the match, blamed the galaxy, and sent Thorn to clean it up. Wexon folded his hands, and he succeeded. The suit nodded, and now Earth leads. Dirk walked out of the chamber that night with a target painted on his back, and Thorn's words echoing in his head. Don't let them come back. They weren't just about the Drakish. They were about us, about the rot inside Earth, the quiet betrayal, the price of power. Months passed. The public never saw the full message. Thorn became a legend, a Myth, a symbol for whatever each person needed him to be, for some a monster, for others a savior. But Dirk knew the truth, the war wasn't over, it had just changed shapes, and the fire that Thorn started, it still burned. Durich didn't return to Earth. After the Senate hearing, he was scheduled to. His name was on the itinerary, his ship, a sleek diplomatic cruiser, even launched toward orbit. The broadcast feeds to track, but the man never boarded. By the time the Senate realized he was gone, the remembrance had already vanished from all systems. No transponder signal, no flight logs, no comms, vanished into the belt systems beyond Jupiter like a ghost, which is exactly what he intended. Because ghosts can't be killed. In the asteroid field near Saros 5, a forgotten mining colony lay abandoned since the Dominion Wars. Half the structures were collapsed, the air filtration system barely held together with rust and glue. Power was intermittent, lightless, cold. Perfect, it wasn't a base, not yet, but it would be. Dirk stood in the old comms tower, coat heavy with frost, staring down at the shattered domes and blacked-out buildings below. The place was dead. Everyone believed that. He intended to keep it that way. Because he wasn't building a rebellion for the cameras, he was building one to win. The first to arrive was Captain Aaron. Somehow she'd survived the suicide run near the Drakish mother ship. Her ship had limped into the Caroline ice fields, floating there for weeks until a salvage rig found them. Half her crew was dead, the rest barely breathing. She shouldn't have been walking, but when she stepped off the shuttle into Saros 5's atmosphere, she stood straight, shoulders square, as if she were walking onto the battlefield again. She didn't ask questions, she just said, "What do you need?" Durich only nodded. "The truth." Next came two engineers from the Black Armada, a pair of grizzled techs who had personally worked under Thorn during the final weeks. One of them, Toma, was the one who'd recovered the plasma distortion logs, the data proving that the Drakish tech had been mixed with Earth origin code. The other, Keeley, had been part of the AI countermeasures division. She'd seen Dominion virus signatures rewritten in Terran formatting, almost identical to the stealth systems used in Earth's own recon ships. It wasn't just conspiracy anymore, it was evidence. By the end of the month, Dirk had 12 loyalists, 12 men and women who had served in the fire, buried friends in hell breaches, bled on the decks of dying ships. None of them wanted fame, none of them were interested in becoming figureheads. They just wanted one thing: answers. Dirk held his first briefing in the crumbling war room of Saros 5's command tower. A flickering projector displayed what little they had: Thorn's final message, the code anomalies, fragments of destroyed Drakish tech, and a pattern hidden in the Senate's post-war decisions. The dots were connecting, and what they revealed was something worse than treason. "I don't think the war was about stopping the Dominion," Dirk said, voice steady as the others gathered around. "I don't even think it was about defeating the Drakish." Toma scratched his beard. "Then what the hell was it for?" Durich pointed at the projection, a list of military contracts signed in the weeks before the Drakish invasion even began. Everything from deep space dreadnought expansions to AI research grants, all approved before the first Drakish ship was even sighted. They were preparing for a war they hadn't announced, a war they weren't planning to stop. Keely stepped forward. You're saying they knew? Dirk nodded. They built it, theories became facts. The further they dug, the more rot they uncovered. Old connections between Dominion defectors and Earth's upper brass, secret facilities in the Obsidian Reach long thought abandoned now. Humming with activity. Unregistered research programs tracing back to corporations with no public fronts, only acronyms and black walls. One name kept appearing in the shadows. Virex Holdings, no public face, no CEO. Just files signed by authorized director. And buried behind a wall of military-grade encryption, Durich had never heard of them, but Thorne had. He found it buried in the data core of Thorne's last ship log, a final note. Encrypted, almost missed, one word. Virex. They weren't just rebuilding Drakish tech, they were adapting it. Dirk's team retrieved fragments from the wreckage at Point 17, one of the last battles. Inside a collapsed warp pod, they found what looked like organic processors, fused directly with Dominion-era navigational cores, biological interfaces that responded to human neural patterns experiments. Kelly ran a simulation. When connected to their systems, the hybrid core immediately tried to overwrite the ship's AI. Not to destroy, but to merge, a living, thinking fighting system. It wasn't just invasion, it was evolution. Durich stared at the pulsing core under containment and said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to the others. If this reaches Earth's Black Labs, we'll lose more than ships. Captain Arlen frowned. How do we stop them? We expose it, all of it. You think the people care? They'll believe what the Senate feeds them. Durich nodded slowly. Then we give them something the Senate can't bury. And so began Operation Emberfall, a multi-stage plan to breach Virex Holdings' hidden facility near the Lauren Delta Nebula, where insider data hinted they were growing hybrid ships fusing Drakish tissue with Terran steel. They couldn't take the facility in a fight. But they didn't need to, they just needed the proof. Keely built the infiltration algorithms. Toma rigged their transport with Old Dominion cloak tech. Arland reassembled a skeleton crew of Marines who'd served under Thorne, the last 12, every one of them presumed dead or missing by the time the Remembrance jumped into Lauren Delta space. The fire was already burning. Inside the station, they saw things none of them would forget. Ships in the shape of insects fed by mechanical tendrils. Men hooked to neural rigs, their skin burned, eyes dilated, muttering phrases in Drakish tongue, and worst of all, children cloned grown in tanks wired to hybrid control systems. The future, a biosynthetic navy, no crews, no loyalty, just obedience. It wasn't defense, it was domination, and Earth was building it. They uploaded everything, visuals, audio, DNA samples, footage of experiments, communications between Senate offices and Virex personnel. Then they ran back through slip space, through Dominion ruin, through storms that nearly tore the Remembrance apart. By the time they emerged near Titan Relay, they had less than 10% hull integrity, but the data was intact, and Durich made the call. Public leak, no negotiations, no blackmail. He sent it directly to every independent news node, every rogue AI collective, every free world broadcasting satellite. And when the file went live, the galaxy stopped breathing. The footage spread faster than war. Earth's alliances fractured. Overnight, protests burned in the streets, senators fled. President Haver went silent, Varex's holdings purged their facilities, but it was too late because now everyone knew. Durich didn't return to Earth. He didn't need to. He'd already done what Thorn couldn't. He cut the rod out, but he didn't do it for glory. He did it because he still heard Thorn's voice at night, still saw that last message burned into his mind. Don't let them come back. But deep in the obsidian reach, in a facility that hadn't been listed on any map, someone watched the fallout unfold, not shocked, not panicked, just smiling. A man in a suit, perfectly pressed, poured himself a drink and looked at the monitor. One of the hybrid cores pulsed in containment. Another message blinked onto the screen, a single file. Name Thorn X. He raised his glass to Phase 2, he whispered and drank. The file was labeled Thorn X. It wasn't military standard, no encryption, no access lock, just a black box icon floating in a secure Virex terminal deep within the obsidian reach, the kind of place that didn't exist on any map. No doors, no windows, just steel, silence, and secrets. The man in the suit, the same one from the Senate hearing, leaned closer, his reflection caught in the screen. For months they'd buried Thorn's legacy, controlled the narrative, deleted files, rewrote records, declared him a tragic hero who burned too brightly. They had erased him, but this file had just appeared on its own. He hovered a finger over the console, then hesitated. The words at the top of the file had changed. Command received. Awaiting I. He blinked. Awaiting I. He turned his head, and the retinal scanner next to the console flickered on. A thin red beam stretched out and locked onto his iris. ID confirmed. Director 04, initializing. Protocol Prometheus. The screen dimmed and then Thorn appeared, not a picture, a fully interactive simulation. Flesh, voice, memory, tone, but it wasn't a man on a screen. It wasn't a recording. It was alive, a replica so real it made the director's skin crawl. The digital Thorn sat in a command chair, uniform intact, eyes cold. His voice echoed with familiar steel. If you're watching this, then your leash finally slipped. You killed me once. That was your first mistake. Letting me come back, that'll be your last. The simulation leaned forward. Let me show you what you buried. Back on Sarowo's 5, Durich stood in the remains of the command tower, staring at the chaos he'd unleashed. The public leak of Project Emberfall had torn Earth's alliances to pieces. Riots erupted across the colonies. The Senate was in lockdown, and dozens of quiet disappearances hinted that whoever survived in Varix was tying off the last loose ends. But it wasn't the protests that disturbed him. It was the lack of answers. No official response, no public denial, just silence, like someone was waiting. Captain Arland walked in, bruised and covered in grease from fixing their comm systems. We've got another signal, she said, from Earth. She shook her head. Worse. The signal was fragmented, laced with old Drakish distortion, but the base encryption was tan. Kelly worked for 2 hours to clean it up, and what came through chilled every person in the room. It was Thorn, not a message, not a log, but a live signal. Impossible, Toma whispered. He died. The ship went down. The entire goddamn retribution burned. Dirk stared at the screen. Thorn looked pale, thinner, like a ghost barely clinging to the edges of his form, but it was him, and His voice hadn't changed. Durich, you need to listen, they found. At the seed. They think they're building weapons, but it's building them. Static crackled, the screen flickered, the Drakish weren't. The enemy, they were the response. Were the infection, and they were the cure. The signal died, it didn't make sense. None of it did, but Dirk knew two things. With absolute certainty, one, Thorn was alive, two, whatever was coming next was worse than anything they'd already survived. They traced the signal. It had bounced through 7 relay buoys, 3 dead systems, and a Dominion era listening post that should have been space dust. The endpoint Narrows Station, a black site so deep in the reach it wasn't even listed on Virex's internal servers. Thorn had mentioned it once long ago in passing, a place Earth used to send failed AI experiments, corrupted soldiers, genetic disasters, a dumping ground for sins. Durich made the call. They were going. The journey to Narrows was hell. Halfway through the reach, the nav systems began failing. Keeley swore it wasn't a glitch, it was like the system itself was rewriting their coordinates. The stars shifted, the engines groaned, and the remembrance began hearing things. Whispers through the hull. Static that sounded like screaming. Shadows moving across the viewport when no one was there. Toma nearly cracked. He tried to eject himself in the medbay, mumbling about eyes inside his head. They had to restrain him. By the time they reached Narrows, only 8 of them were still functional. The station floated like a tomb, a jagged spear of black steel against the void, surrounded by dead satellites and flickering grav beacons. No docking permissions, no automated defense grid, just a single blinking light on the main hangar bay. Like it was waiting. Inside, the walls bled, not literally, but that's how it felt. Organic matter fused with metal, veins pulsing through support beams, echoes of movement in the dark. Keeley checked her scanner. There's a signal deep in the core. Something massive. Arlen raised her rifle. We moving? Dirk nodded. Stay close, no heroics. They advanced through corridors lined with machinery that breathed. Durich wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that it was alive or the fact that it wasn't attacking like it recognized them. In the core chamber they found him, Admiral Thorn. Half his body was mechanical, burned scars covered his face. Tubes ran from his spine into the wall behind him, plugged directly into the station itself. He looked up, smiled. About time. Durich stepped forward, heart frozen in his chest. Admiral, how the hell? I didn't die, Thorn said quietly. I transferred. He tapped the wall. This station isn't a dump, it's a fail-safe built by the first generation after the Exodus War. They knew what Earth might become, so they left something behind. He gestured to the glowing mass at the center of the chamber, a swirling orb of red-black energy pulsing like a heartbeat. The seed, a neural core, a thinking weapon, not Drakish, not Terran, something older, something we never should have touched. Keeley stared at it. It's alive. Thorn nodded. It showed me the truth. The Drakish weren't invaders. They were symptoms, reactions, defense mechanisms. The real threat isn't them. He looked at Durich. It's us. Durich clenched his fists. I didn't come all this way for prophecy. Thorn stepped forward. You came because you knew something was wrong. You saw what Virex was building, what the Senate was covering up. You followed the blood trail. He pointed to the seed. It ends here. Keeley stepped forward. What happens if They get this thing. Thorn's face darkened. They become gods. Or worse. He tapped a panel on the wall. And they're already close. Back on Earth, the director sat alone in a sealed chamber. He watched the red light on his console pulse in rhythm. With something far away, Prometheus link. Active. He smiled. You always were a stubborn bastard, Thorn. He pulled a key from around his neck, old-fashioned, physical, untraceable, and inserted it into the console. The screen changed. Phase 3 initiation. Far in the stars, deep in the dark, a fleet began to move. Not Terran, not Drakish, something in between, born of betrayal, fueled by vengeance, commanded by silence, and in the heart of Narrow Station, Thorn looked at Durich one last time. I need you to make a choice. Durich's voice was low. What choice? Thorn's eyes burned. Whether we end this or become it. The chamber pulsed like a living thing, every breath from the seed core sent a shiver through the walls. Red-black light swirled behind its translucent shell, veins of unknown energy stretching like nerves through the station's superstructure. It wasn't just connected to Narrows, it was Narrows. Durich stood in the center of it all, sweat dripping down his back, fists clenched as Thorn, half man, half machine, waited for his answer. All this time, Dirk said slowly, we thought the Dikesh were monsters. Thorn nodded, because it was easier. Easier than admitting Earth had become the disease. Behind them, Captain Arlen Keeley and the rest of the surviving crew stood in uneasy silence. They weren't sure who Thorn was anymore, if he was still human or something else entirely. Thorn noticed the hesitation in their eyes, the doubt. He didn't blame them. I died in that collision, he said quietly, but the seed wouldn't let me go. It had seen enough war, enough extinction. It pulled what was left of me into its neural web. Memory, identity. It made me into a voice, not for vengeance but warning. Durich stepped forward. So why bring us here? Why not destroy this yourself? Thorn's face was hard. Because I'm compromised. I'm part of it now. My will isn't clean, but yours still is. The walls vibrated again. Keeley turned to her console. Something's happening. External pressure rising. There's movement. Ships. Arland said, I see them. The monitors flared. Fleet, dozens of them. Black holes, no insignia. Engine trails like living smoke. Not Terran, not Dikesh. Hybrid. Dirk's stomach twisted. The director. Thorn nodded. Phase 3, the console lit up. Prometheus link established. Neural core activation 81%. Receiving commands. They're trying to take control, Keeley said. The seed there sinking with it. Toma looked horrified. What happens if they succeed? Thorn didn't hesitate. They become gods. The fleet outside was forming a blockade. No weapons fired yet, but it was only a matter of time. Durich turned to the others. If they link fully to the seed, they won't need weapons. They'll be able to rewrite biological and digital systems. Every ship, every colony, every mind that's even partially augmented. Keeley swallowed hard. That's half the galaxy, Arlen added. The other half won't survive the cleansing. Thorn walked to the center console. Veins of red light crawling beneath his skin. I've isolated a kill switch, he said. One command, one final override. It burns the seed and everything connected to it, me included. Dirk narrowed his eyes. So do it. Thorn shook his head. I told you I'm compromised. If I try It'll fight me, you have to trigger it. It has to be human hands, untouched. Dirk stared at the panel, a single button glowing white in a sea of red. It looked so harmless, but pressing it would destroy everything Thorn had become, everything the seed had stored. No backups, Thorn said, no second chances. Kelly leaned in. What happens to the hybrid fleet? They die with it. Dirk stepped forward, and the knowledge gone. Arlen frowned. That's a lot of sacrifice. All that advancement isn't worth the cost, Thorn said. You saw what Virex built, what the Senate allowed. You give humanity this power. They won't use it for peace. They'll build their own Drakish. He looked straight at Dirk. Like I said, you have to choose. Outside, the first shots fired. A hybrid destroyer unleashed a blast of black plasma, slicing through one of Narrow's outer pylon. The station shook. Sparks fell from the ceiling. Shields down to 42%. Keeley reported, we won't last long. Durich stared at the button. It felt like standing at the edge of the galaxy, staring into the throat of a god. He could walk away, let the future play out, let Earth evolve into something stronger, colder, unified through control, or he could burn it all. Arlen stepped beside him. You don't have to do this, she said. Durich didn't answer. He was thinking of New Damascus, of Thorn's daughter, of the blackened cities, of the corpses floating in Zerog, of the Senate pretending it never happened. He was thinking of how peace had been bought, not earned, with lies and blood and shadows, and how it would be bought again unless someone said, enough. He raised his hand, paused. Thorn, the man looked up. If I do this, what's left? Thorn didn't smile. He didn't plead. He just said hope. Dirk pressed the button. The seed let out a scream. It wasn't audible, not in any traditional sense, but it vibrated through bone, through steel, through thought. Every person in that chamber dropped to their knees, clutching their heads. Light filled the room. Black light, red light, ancient light. The walls cracked. The veins burst. The entire station began to collapse in on itself, not exploding, but imploding, as if reality itself was being eaten from within. Outside, the hybrid fleet reacted. Ships froze mid-movement, engines sputtered. And then silence. One by one they died, not in fire and disconnection, like puppets with cut strings inside the core. Thorn was the last to speak. His voice was fading, barely a whisper. You made the right choice. Dirk stumbled forward. You'll die here. Thorn smiled, not bitter, not angry. Good. His body began to dissolve pixel by pixel, thread by thread. I was never supposed to survive. I was just the sword. His final words were almost lost in the roar of light. Make sure no one picks it up again. And then he was gone. The team escaped in a crippled shuttle, barely clearing Narrow's orbit before the station collapsed into a singularity of light and sound. They watched it from afar, a dark star imploding, taking with it every trace of the seed, the core, the rot, and Thorn. Back on Earth, the fallout was immediate. Without the seed, Virex's infrastructure collapsed. Without the hybrid fleet, the power grab failed. Senate fractured, and in the chaos that followed, the truth finally came out. All of it, from New Damascus to Emberfall, from Drakish betrayal to Earth's complicity. The galaxy burned with truth, and then it began to heal. Durich never returned to public life. He didn't want parades or medals. He Retired to a dust-covered outpost on Titan, running hydro systems for colonists who had no idea who he really was. Keeley joined a research ship one that promised no weapons contracts. Arlen disappeared into deep space. Rumor said she became a pirate hunter or a smuggler or both, but the name Thor lived on, not in textbooks, not in monuments, in warnings, and every few years a strange signal would whisper through the old relays, not a message, not a command, just 5 words over and over. Don't let them come back.